5D Mystery School.
Welcome back to 5D Mystery School. Let's get into it. So, when you go to the indoctrination system, aka the schooling system, one of the things that they teach you is that this is old America. There was nothing but desert land and little Native American villages. What they don't tell you is that it actually looked more like this. And this. Oh yeah, this too. Sauce. And this. This is Sioux City, Iowa, 1850. So what we do know is that there was an industrial revolution that started from 1760 to about 1820 to 1840. Pretty much new businesses booming, new infrastructure being laid, new cities, new towns, new people to populate those towns, right? But what was prior to this? It was big cities flourishing with architecture that looked like this. And this as well. This is unlike anything that we're building in modern day times. It's distinctly different, right? So most of the buildings that look like this were destroyed during a mud flood. So we're left with buildings that look like this, and then you can tell it's like a full layer of history that was buried, right? And then most of these buildings like this, when you look at the deed, right, it says founded. It doesn't say built. A lot of them says founded because they were found after the mud flood, and then they were built upon to start the Industrial Revolution. And then, in cities like here in Detroit, Chicago, New York especially, you'll see a lot of headstones and buildings that look like this. It's just remnants of the civilizations that were here before us. So after the mud floods, you had entire cities that were just deserted, right? And they needed to be built again. You needed to have people come into these towns. And the big question is, how do you get those people to come and populate these towns? We'll get into that in a second. Another thing that you found in these cities, as I explained in another video, you had churches that were healing centers. You can go in here, and on top of the buildings, you had these unique bald roofs that were anodes and cathodes, and these supplied healing energies, healing frequencies that they tapped into from the ether. One of those cities would have looked something like this here, more advanced than our modern day cities. And these civilizations, they weren't just here in the United States. Boy, they were everywhere. Footwork, heavy. Now this is from the 1300s, and to this day we still can't replicate the same architecture. I mean, probably close, but no cigar. So, do you know what this is? Bet you never saw this before. This is a orphan train. And it is exactly what it sounds like. The orphan train movement was a supervised welfare program that transported children from crowded eastern cities of the United States to foster homes located largely in rural areas of the Midwest. The orphan trains operated from 1854 to 1929, relocating about 200,000 children. These co-founders of the orphan train movement claimed that these children were orphaned, abandoned, abused, or homeless, but this was not always true. You can just pause to read the rest. It's just crazy. Of these 200,000 children, there were 30,000 in New York City alone in the 1850s. So hold up, pause, backtrack. We're not gonna gloss over this. 200,000 misplaced children. And look at these children. They all the same race. Now y'all see why they call it the baby boomers. Nah, but for real, how did these children come about? I'm sure that's what any intelligent mind is thinking right now. Because you know how many women would have to have these children consecutively to have 200,000 children, and just to give them away, nobody wanted them. You don't find that suspicious? So a lot of these babies came from, they were the incubator babies, right, of Coney Island and of other places. This is from 2017. Infant who survived in 1920 sideshow incubator dies at 96. So this means that we still have a generation of these incubator babies today. And it's the baby boomer generation because the business of babies was booming. So there's nothing new under the sun. I showed you this the other day, making babies, how to create human embryos with no egg or sperm. Incubator babies 10.0. So ask yourself, 200,000 misplaced children. Where do these children really come from? You had cities that were destitute, that badly needed rebuilding, badly needed populations to have this industrial revolution successful, to actually make it work. I mean, industrial revolution, 1760s, right? 1820 to 1840. A lot of these buildings were founded in the 1700s, 1800s, after the mud floods. All right, so they found the buildings and they need to rebuild them. Look at the dates, Industrial Revolution. Orphan trains, look at the dates, 1854, 1929. They needed these bodies to be in these cities. 200,000 bodies that were going to grow and work and have this Industrial Revolution booming. They were the baby boomers to help the Industrial Revolution boom. I'll leave you with this. This is a Tartarian insane asylum left over from the mud floods. This is where they put the people that survived and were trying to tell other people what happened, and then they were labeled crazy or maybe even conspiracy theorists.
5D Mystery School.
5D Mystery School. All right, so this is Industrial Revolution Part 2. So during the Industrial Revolution, part of the reset was the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu came in and affected a third of the world's population. And it claimed the lives to about 17 to 50 million people. That was reported, so you know how the numbers go. They had a second, third, and a fourth wave, the last wave being in the 1920s. It was the same rules and procedures that you would see today. You had to distance, you had to wear a mask. And in the 1920s, you had another wave of these incubator babies. But before all that, before they can really have these incubator babies grow and flourish, they had to lay the foundation. John D. Rockefeller started the General Education Board in 1902 to indoctrinate these babies before they can fully grow and become workers, because he wanted a nation of workers, not thinkers. And he started it for about $129 million. But everybody had to fall in line, so of course you had Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which means more people were indoctrinated into these systems. But this isn't the first time where I've mentioned that you had like babies created in a lab, right? Or some type of humans created in a lab. If you trace it all the way back to Yaqub and the lab and created an entire race, then you know you have that whole lineage. But the way that incubator babies were sold was that it was for premature babies so that they can make it fully through birth without complications. But at the World's Fair, you had some like 80,000 babies in these incubators, and it doesn't match the population rate and the amount of white women that were giving birth at that time. So you had a large number of these incubator babies that were pretty much like sideshows, and that they were growing, you know, little white babies like popcorn. And you guys in the comments kept mentioning the Cabbage Patch Kids, and I thought that it was oddly peculiar how it all correlates with these the orphan trains, and it correlates with these incubator babies, because these Cabbage Patch Kids, they were sold like this, like looking really deformed, almost conditioning the mind to accept these deformed, old-looking children. And here's a postcard, you know, from back in those times where you had like Cabbage Patch Kids, where it implies that these little babies were grown in a field, you know, Cabbage Patch Kids. You know, it's crazy, those Cabbage Patch Kids were sold with these certificates like birth certificates or social security cards. And around that time, you had an increasing need for orphan protections. Industrial Revolution, Part 3. So in a nutshell, you have the World War to fatten the pockets of the elusive controllers. You have the Industrial Revolution to reset and clear the stage. You have the education system and the ending of segregation. You have a worldwide pandemic to balance out the population. You have great fires to destroy history, along with floods. And of course, you have large populations of people being created to populate these new towns and cities of the Industrial Revolution. So in a way, artificial life found a way to create more of itself. Populating major cities, making major people think that they are minor, aka the indigenous peoples. Governments were established for power, and part of that power was distributed through banks, which is why the banking system, aka the Federal Reserve, to back major banks was established in 1913, 101 years after the War of 1812. And if you're good with history, you know how the rest of it goes, leading up to where we are today. It's like a long, continuous, repeating loop, but modernized themes. But real quick, going back to the orphanages, you had a large number of orphanages popping up, especially around New York City, because you had a large number of, they called homeless children. This is where you had the orphan trains that came in. And where did all these children come from is still the larger question. And also during that time, it was being conditioned, especially through like Disney, of orphans. You had like the Jungle Book, you had Peter Pan, you had the idea of orphans just like being put out there. So in a way, it's like these baby incubators were producing like products, for you to take home and almost treat like other than, like having your kid on a leash that you still might see today. But as you can see, these incubator babies came out looking super deformed, like almost like those Cabbage Patch Kids. So you can only wonder what is the lifespan for these incubator babies, because in a way, like their life was created artificially. Now, when I say that they were being treated other than, you had this, right? This weird history of the baby cage. You had these baby cages that were propped up in the windows. Why would you hang your baby over like 12 or 20 stories? Anyway, they would air them out so they wouldn't have to like take them for walks or anything, almost like a pet, right? But I'll leave you with this because, we can go on. But if you're talking about the lifespan for these things, now you have the birth rate of some women decreasing, and now is calling for another great reset. And as mentioned before, this is from 2017. You had a woman who was 96, and she was one of those incubator babies. Looks like the lifespan is up. 5B Mystery School. So what if I told you that we are not in the year 2022, but more like the year 1725? So there's something called the phantom time theory, where 1,000 years were added on to the Gregorian calendar from changing it from the Julian calendar. According to the phantom time hypothesis, Charlemagne never existed, along with 297 years that were just made up. So this means that the Dark Ages never existed. Alright, so this comes from Thought Catalog. Phantom time hypothesis was a 300-year chunk of Europe's Dark Ages completely made up. Phantom time hypothesis claims that the years 1614 through 911 never happened, and that we're actually living in the 1700s right now. You can pause to read this little clever intro right there. But before I read this next part, do me a favor and do your research on the Dark Ages and see how many arts and writings that you can come up with. German historian Heribert Illig first published his phantom time hypothesis in 1991. He'd been working on this idea since learning of a 1986 archaeological conference that discussed the Roman Catholic Church's practice of forging documents in the Middle Ages and predating them by hundreds of years. Illig focused on Pope Gregory, introduction of the Gregorian calendar in 1582, which is still the main calendar used to conduct business throughout the world today. The problem with the Julian calendar, which had been in use since the Roman times, is that it overestimated the length of an average year about 11 minutes. Although that doesn't sound like much, it would have added up to a drift about 13 days between Roman times and the year 1582. Alright, and this comes from Q Meta on stolenhistory.net. People that went to sleep on October 4, 582 AD woke up Monday, October 18, 1582 AD. Their source of the time and date was the church. They were led to believe that the Julian date of Sunday, October 4th, 582 AD was followed by Friday, October 15th, 582 AD on a new Gregorian calendar. The rest just tells you about the days that were added. For decades, prior people, especially monks, were writing I when they wrote the year to denote what we would call today AD or Anno Domini in Latin. The year 500, for example, was written as I 500 to signify that something was written 500 years after the birth of Jesus Christ. I was used to denote Jesus in Latin, which was written as Iosus. Later, J was used. Then over time, the small i's and j's were transformed into large i's and j's, then finally a 1. Year 600 AD has changed from being written from 600 to I600 to J600 to 1600. Seen here, you can see the J's written here. All right. 5D Mystery School. So, one of the biggest reasons why they didn't want you to know about the Tartarians comes from the CIA document. Just check it out. Or let us take the matter of history, which, along with religion, language, and literature, constitute the core of a people's cultural heritage. Here again, the communists have interfered in a shameless manner. For example, on 9 August 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, sitting in Moscow, issued a directive ordering the party's Tartar Provincial Committee to proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria to liquidate the serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by the individual writers and historians in dealing with Tartar history. In other words, Tartar history was to be rewritten, let us be frank, was to be falsified in order to eliminate references to great Russian aggressions and to hide the facts of the real course of Tartar-Russian relations. And this was no isolated case. In every Muslim area within the USSR, historians on the facts so that the Russians appear always in a good light. Needless to say, histories which present the facts truthfully have been withdrawn and destroyed so that the present and future generations of Muslims are forever denied the chance of learning the true facts of their nation's past. And so another thing with these world fairs is that with a lot of them, they constructed these world fairs for like city blocks, right? And they were held for sometimes 3 to 6 months, sometimes to a year. But then the buildings, the architecture were all tore down. They said the reasoning being that the buildings were made with cheap material and they were only supposed to be temporary. Now, come on. Some of these buildings, you know, they weren't built to be temporary. Why would you build this? And some buildings were 28 acres in size. I mean, some pieces from like the modern day World's Fairs we still have around. This wheel is actually here in Michigan, in Detroit. Well, on your way to Detroit. But most of these buildings with the World's Fairs, they say that they constructed in less than a year. And even with today's machinery, that is, it's just not fathomable. And so they constructed this for a year to only use it for 3 to 6 months. Now in comparison, here is what modern day minds build. This is what they were building then. Again, notice the roof, distinct craftsmanship of Tartarian architecture. So did they really construct these grandiose type of buildings in less than a year? Or Industrial Revolution Part 6. Okay, so could it be that they didn't actually build up these, grandiose type of buildings for the purposes of the World's Fair, but actually they repurposed founded buildings, show them off as if it was their buildings for the World Fair, and then they destroy the buildings so that people would not ask the questions that we are asking today. Because if you pulled up to Chicago today and you saw all of these, type of buildings, this architecture that doesn't match what we are building, right? The unseasoned kind of buildings that we're building today, you would start to ask questions like, what civilization built this? But again, their reasoning is that everything that you're seeing here was cheaply made for the purposes of the World's Fair and was then destroyed after. Now, I'm sure it's no coincidence, but at the end of some of these world fairs, some fires broke out and some buildings were destroyed. You see, this is the 1893 World's Fair, fire killed 16. This isn't really significant, but I saw Detroit, so anyway, giant stove from 1893 World's Fair destroyed by fire in Detroit. Fire at the 1904 World's Fair. And here's one of the buildings. This building right here spanned 23 acres. The fair boasted 1,500 buildings. There were palaces the size of several city blocks. The Palace of Agriculture was the largest of them. all covering 23 acres and containing a working dairy farm, cider mill, and an olive oil factory. And here's the article if you want to check that out. Also, let's not forget, Chicago has a great history, but a lot of that history, look at the dates. The Great Chicago Fire was in 1871, around the time of these World Fairs. Going back to that CIA document about Russia, you look at this building in Russia, right? It has Tartarian architecture written all over it. And I'm willing to bet Tartarians got super close to the North Pole, Eden, Mount Meru, if not, they didn't get all the way down in there, and that's where a lot of the civilization went. Here's the Capitol building from Helsinki, closer to the North Pole. Literally everywhere. So you see this Capitol building from Helsinki, right? Now, of course, you're familiar with the U.S. Capitol building, and this entire building has a layer of history buried underneath, proven mud floods. So another thing is when you look on a map of Tartaria, they have some really peculiar illustrations on the side. If you can see the bottom there, it looks like a black sun and a sun. Industrial Revolution, Part 7. So going back to this map, right, of Tartaria. So on the bottom left, you can see it's like the sun, our sun, emerging from the middle. It says La Terra, like Middle Earth, or, like another name for Earth. You have Gaia, Terra, and Earth. So you have the sun emerging from the black sun, from the Middle Earth. And you see this depiction here. And right here, of course, you have the Copernic model and going up. And then here, of course, Ptolemy, and then just different levels of the hemisphere, they say. And here you have Descartes. But my bigger question was like, why would they have this on a map of Tartaria? Like, the dates don't add up. And another map that I saw, they had Nero. And immediately I thought, like, why would they have Nero on a map of Tartaria where, Nero, he began his reign in 54 CE. And then, of course, that was brought me to this phantom time hypothesis where, 1,000 years was added on to the Gregorian calendar, which wiped out a lot of history and made up a lot of false history. So think, if you were in 582 and then next thing you know, you're in 1582, how many years later, it's like the 1700s and the mud floods, right? Like 200 something years. Because a lot of Tartarian history wouldn't add up, right? It wouldn't fit the timeline that we were taught. So something else I want to touch on that's a piece of Tartarian leftover history, that, or at least that could tie to Tartarian history, is the star forts that appeared, right? These star forts appear everywhere. Here's another. And you know that we're not building anything like this today, for sure. Here's another. Now you could speculate as for the purposes of these star forts, but I just think that it's another piece of history that is connecting to Tartarian history that we can start to tie the complete timeline together, see what pieces are missing and see what adds together. And here's one more. So one thing that stands out with these buildings, these Tartarian type of buildings, is the roofs, especially the tips of the roof. Now that's called antiquitech, right? Like antiquity technology, and it's for harnessing the frequencies from the ether. And you'll see a lot of these antiquitech type of models on older churches today. That's why churches were healing centers. They used to have like stations, right? Like wireless stations where energy just went out to the city using this antiquitech type of technology. And this is all Tartarian type of architecture. You see the arc at the top, right? Well, those two are just pieces of Tartarian architecture left over. Here's one from New York and one from Paris. I'll do mystery school. All right, so continuing on with this Industrial Revolution lecture, I wanted to tap back in with these orphan trains. So these orphan trains were filled with children called foundlings. And the reason is in the name because supposedly they were found, so they were foundlings. Now, after the mud floods, you had towns that were completely destitute, right? They were in need of repopulating. And this is where the arms of the Foundling Hospital come in. Just take a quick look at the logo. And just look at the woman, right? She looks odd. Looks like she has an extra pair of something. Yeah. But that is symbolic. And I think it's pretty peculiar that the symbol on the bottom says help. And these large orphan hospitals is where they were kept. Now take a look at these hospitals. Look at the design. Looks familiar, right? This is Tartarian architecture. Now these were buildings that were left over, and they repurposed them and they turned them into asylums. One purpose is for the people who survived the mud flood. They were put in asylums so that they wouldn't go around and spread these conspiracies. And another was they were these large storage stations for these foundlings that were being created. So here's a large one in Los Angeles. Here's one in New York. Here's another in New York. Now really look at this one. An asylum this scale, y'all really needed it back then. Again, one of the purposes for that large facility was to house these foundlings. Here's another angle. They were all taught the same curriculum to believe the same things. They were programs. They all had to stick with the programs, right? Because they were foundlings, they were created, they were empty shells, and they all had to be, the programs had to be installed, right? The software had to be installed. And of course, they got older and got into some trouble. Here is a party where people look like me were dangling from trees. And as you can see, it just looks like a bunch of people with no souls that all had one particular program that they were sticking to. And I guess part of that program was to eliminate melanated peoples. And then they were transported from those large asylums into people's homes. That's where these posters went up in every city pretty much. And then they became the citizens of New America. So a lot of these people that you see are the ones that got older and the ones that we call Karens today. And they're the offsprings of these foundlings. So how many times can a clone give birth? Right. Now you understand and hopefully overstand the birth decline in certain women. Now moving along, let's talk about these forged phantom years and how it connects to Tartaria. Industrial Revolution, Part 9. So we know that the United States is only 246 years old. Or at least that's what they tell us. Let's just keep in mind that with time, even with these timelines, if they're corrected, that those timelines still might be wrong. Because our history is written by the victors, and majority of the history that we're taught was was written or rewritten by one man. And that man is Joseph Justus Scaliger. Joseph Justus Scaliger was a French Calvinist religious leader and scholar known for expanding the notion of classical history from Greek and ancient Roman history to include Persian, Babylonian, Jewish, and ancient Egyptian history. All right, so from the Britannica, you can see that he was a Dutch theologist and historian whose works on chronology were among the greatest contributions of Renaissance scholars to revisions in historical and classical studies. So a lot of the history that we learn in schools is his story. Let me take you to some coins now. Here is the first coin that was available in the USA. Very symbolic, right? The all-seeing eye with the rays all around it. If you ask me, I would say that this is symbolic of the sun. All right, here is a picture of the back, and if look at the date at the bottom, you can see that the date, it doesn't say 1783, it says J783. Here's a closer look. Here's another coin here. You can see at the top the date. At first glance, you might think that it says 1594, but it actually says I-594. And of course, I stands for Iosis, which stands for the year of the Lord, the year of Jesus. Here's just a look at the front of that. Here is another coin, and on this coin you might think that the year says 1546, but that actually is I-546. A closer look at that for you. Here's another, you can see Anno Domini at the top, AD, and at the bottom is J690, not 1690, but that's J690. And then remember later that J over time was changed to a 1. And so it went from being like 690 to 1690, right? And here's another coin. You might think this date says 1652, but it's I-652, the year of the Lord, 652. Here's a William Tyndale Bible, the New Testament. You can see the date says I-526. Here's another Bible at the bottom. You can see it says I-539. Here's another Bible at the bottom. You can see it says I-599. Again, not 1599, but I-599. Industrial Revolution, Part 10. Let's dive deep. So continuing with this timeline, one of the things that we were taught in modern day schooling is that slavery began in 1619, or at least this is when the first captives were brought over to America. So keep that in mind as we move along. Not only did they have white orphan asylums, but they had colored orphan asylums as well. Here's one of them. Now, where did these children come from? Now, I know that your first educated guess would probably be they were taken from captives, right? Like slaves that were brought over here from Africa, as they tell us. But I'm not sure that's the case. You'll see as we move along. Here is another photo of a colored orphan house. Here's another. Here is another, but you can see it's some carnage happening here. They set this colored orphan asylum on fire. Here is another. Now you can start to see where these orphan asylums were turned from, asylums to plantations. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these children from these colored orphan asylums actually ended up working on fields, and they were called slaves. Here's another. And looking at this, you'll probably say, oh no, this is like an old plantation house. No, they didn't build this for the purposes of slavery. They stole this building, or they just claimed this empty building, right? Because it was left from the floods. Now, who did these children go to, right? Who claimed these children? Did anybody claim them? If nobody claimed them, then what happened to them? They became servants again. You can even tell the difference in the upkeep with these colored orphan houses and the white orphan houses. Here's a shot of a white orphan asylum. Now, the thing to remember here that's really important is that these orphan trains, they weren't just happening in the USA. They were in Russia, Australia, Germany, Poland, Finland, you name it. Because before the arrival of these people from the orphan train, you had lands that were filled with melanated peoples and the architecture that they left behind. And in their place, you have a new society of these orphan children that are being taught, programmed to take over as the new citizens of America, where they can make up their own last names, right? They grow up to have plantations, and then the slaves that work on their farm ends up taking the last name that they made up. These people didn't have last names. They made up their own last name. They had orphan trains and orphan planes. That's how you got them to these other lands. Alright, take a look. Why do you suppose they tell us nothing about these orphan trains and everything about slavery? So they say slaves arrived in 1500. 5D Mystery School. So continuing on with this Industrial Revolution lecture, you see here we have the arms of the Foundling Hospital. Now, one significant thing I want to point out about this is this woman with the multiple breast. Now, she is symbolic for Artemis, the fertility goddess. And as mentioned in other lectures, Artemis is connected to Corona and Apollo. So depicted here, you have Artemis with her multiple breasts depicting like feeding multiple children. It's symbolic for fertility, right? For having multiple children, for childbirth. She was also known as Diana of Ephesus. And here you can see that she has the multiple breasts everywhere. And at the bottom, you can see that those are actually children attached to her. And as you can see, Britannica actually says that she is the goddess of childbirth. So here you can see the origins of child trafficking. It probably started way before this. So moving right along, now I would like to touch on some architecture briefly. This is my alma mater. This is City College of New York, also known as Poor Man's Harvard or the Castle in Harlem. Shout out to all my CCY alumni. If you went to this college, it's low-key like going to Hogwarts. And you can see the bottom here, like the windows, how the windows are like cut off, how they seem like they almost have more to them, especially compared to the top. That is remnants of the mud flood. This is where the rest of this building was left, but the bottom was covered during those floods. Here's a closer look at that. All right, so this is Shepherd Hall. Moving on. Just to show you the size comparison, how it stands out in Harlem. And here's one of the buildings. You can notice the roof. This roof is seen on a lot of different Tartarian architecture. So you won't only find old Capitol buildings, right, that are old Tartarian architecture. You'll find college campuses, asylums, hospitals, libraries, and especially buildings that look like this. Now, I went out early today to some areas around here in Detroit, and I filmed some architecture, and I'll show you later in the lecture. We have one that's on Woodward Ave that looks just like this. So something else I wanted to point out in connection with this is that it's recently been discovered in 2014 that one of the first writing systems in the world could have been these Tartaria tablets. All right, seen here, these are Tartarian tablets. They are saying that these predate Mesopotamia. One part I want to read, it says, the tablets, which are 1,000 years older than the Mesopotamia writings, contain signs that have remained undeciphered to this day. If you never heard of the Tartarian tablets, you heard it here first. Here are some symbols found on those tablets. All right, let's continue with this Industrial Revolution lecture. So, let's talk about it. Who built the Underground Railroad? What is its true history? So, we were taught that Harriet Tubman made these trips from the southern states to the northern free states, right? Bigger question, did Harriet Tubman actually exist? Or is she a fictitious character, supposedly like Charlemagne? Well, let's continue. Here is a map, one of many of North America from the 1600s. All right, take a look at the land. This is quite different from what we were told the land looked like when the slaves were here, when we were building America. It's funny because America was actually already built. All right, so history of the United States, yada yada, and then they teach us by the 1760s, the 13 British colonies contained 2.5 million people and were established along the Atlantic coast east of the Appalachian Mountains after defeating France and the British government. Well, considering what we know about wars today, do you think that there's a chance that what we were taught about this history is wrong? So America was established in 1776, right? Now, there also was a Great Fire of New York the same year, 1776, and a lot of things were destroyed. A lot of architecture that would raise some questions, right? There was also a Great Fire here in Detroit in 1805, destroyed a lot of history. And if you know anything about Detroit, there is a lot of rich ancient history right here. Oh, there was a war of 1812 shortly after the formation of America, and a lot of history, you guessed it, was destroyed. Now, another piece of this American Revolution would be the automobile. They say the first steam-powered automobile capable of human transportation was built in 1769 by Nicholas Gugnot. But I'm posing that this technology was found by the forefathers, right? It was left by the predecessor civilization. The same civilization that left all of these immaculate buildings. The same civilization that left these star cities, these star forts. Matter of fact, we have a modern remnant of the star fort. Take a look at the Statue of Liberty and let me know what you see. Not only did they have these train systems, these automobiles, these antiquitech, free energy, I personally believe that they were masters of astrology. They mastered free energy from the ether, so it is safe to assume that they mastered how the stars move and how to coordinate events with the movement of those stars. Like I said, it wasn't only over here in the US, but there was fires in Paris. There was a Great Fire of London. Look at the history of anywhere in the world, you'll find us with our eradicated history and forged falsified history. Welcome back to 5D Mystery School. So continuing with this Industrial Revolution lecture. One thing that I would like to point out that in Greek, the way that you pronounce Jesus is Iosis. And so with looking at old dates, you will see the letter I before the year. So in this first picture, you have I, which is for Jesus, the year of the Lord. So it's the year of the Lord, 656, right? In other places, they use J for Jesus. So at the bottom here at the tombstone, you have J794. That's the year of the Lord, 794. All right, so in this photo, you can see a little bit more clear the third photo down where it says Anno, which stands for Anno Domini, which is AD, right? It says J686. So that's the year of the Lord, year 686. And so what happened was over time, they, instead of using the J or the I for iosis, for using Jesus, they switched the J to 1. So it went from being like 686 to the year 1686. Okay, so let's refer back to this article for some numbers. There is scant archaeological evidence that can be pinpointed to the year 600 through 900 CE and very little evidence of new literature and technological advancements. Most historians refer to this time as the Dark Ages and blame it on a cultural decline throughout Europe following the fall of the Roman Empire. So they want you to believe that during that time, even though that there were things to write with, not one single piece of literature was written. No inspiration whatsoever. Nobody was creative at all. That's what they're suggesting here. And the more that you research history, the more inaccuracies that you find. So it would only be logical to dive deeper into this theory. Okay, searching for proof of the church meddling with time, Illig focused on Pope Gregory, introduction of the Gregorian calendar in 1582, which is still the main calendar used to conduct business throughout the world. The problem with the Julian calendar, which had been in the use since Roman times, is that it overestimated the length of an average year in about 11 minutes. Although that doesn't sound like much, it would have added up to a drift of about 13 days between Roman times and 1582. So even if you were to subtract 1,000 years from the year 2022 and you take, let's say, 1,000 years times 13, that gives you 13,000. 13,000 divided by 365, which is the days in a year, gives you something like 36 point, some numbers. And so if you subtract 1,000 years from 2022, then you subtract the 36 years, that would mean that we're in the year like 987. And so that means that we're a lot closer to a lot of these historical events in the classroom that we were taught about. So in the grand scale of things, the Tartarian Empire happened like yesterday. Welcome back to 5D Mystery School, Industrial Revolution, Part 14. So what we are looking at now is the inside of the main branch of the New York Public Library. Because, when you build a library, this is exactly the grand design that you would go for. Even though this was after a mud flood and most of the cities were deserted, so you wouldn't need a library this volume, this size. This is the outside of that library. Just look at this architecture, unlike anything that the modern day man is building. This is the inside of the main branch of the Los Angeles Public Library. Just gander, look at it. It's immaculate. This is the outside of that building. You can see the fine details in the masonry. Take a look at this building. This is the book building here in Detroit, Michigan, my favorite building. Take another look at the detail. While we're here, let's just stick with Detroit for a second. Boss up. So if you have ever visited Detroit and you've seen a lot of these buildings, you would start to ask questions. When I was younger, it really didn't register. Now that I'm older and I'm taking a look around, it doesn't add up. So here's one of those buildings, and this is like a typical building that you'll find here in Detroit. If you're from Detroit, this is regular to you. That was the Art Museum in Detroit. Here it is in color. This is the inside of one of the Presbyterian churches here in Detroit. And we have these old world churches everywhere here, and they all look like this. I actually grew up in one of them. Shout out to Clinton Street Temple. Here's another church here in Detroit. You can see, it looks like a castle. And another Presbyterian church here in Detroit. And a lot of these are in close proximity to the same area, and I'll show you why in a second. Here's another church here. And so if you've ever been to New York, Tribeca, you've seen this building. Now, take a look at the similarities between this building here in New York and then back to the book building in Detroit. Extremely similar, and you can tell by the dome roof here on the top. That is an old world building. And at first glance, with looking at this castle, you can tell that half of it is underground. It looks odd. So this is how most mudflood buildings look. And then a lot of detail that's on these buildings look quite similar to this right here. And one telltale sign that we did not build this is we cannot replicate this same architecture today. Look at this church here in Detroit. I mean, oh my God. I partly grew up in Atlanta, and if you ever been to the ATL, you have seen this building. Who do you think built this? So another example here in Detroit, looks like Harry Potter's home. This is our Capitol building here downtown. Yet another standout building here in Detroit. And for one last, here's a post office here in Detroit. So now let's talk about the layout of these cities. Industrial Revolution, Part 15. Let's get into it. So before talking about the layouts, I just want to show you some photos that I took on my Minolta SRT 101 camera. And these are photos here in Detroit of the architecture. This is the Kells building. And one thing about Detroit is that any building that you see like this, they're all going to have names. And this is in Grand Circus. All right. Which building stands out in this photo? All right. Here's another building. The Penobscot building. Take a look at the details. And another thing that I'll add is when I was growing up, every night before Halloween every year, they would call it Devil's Night. And on Devil's Night, they would go around Detroit and a lot of arson was being done where a lot of homes and buildings that look like this were being destroyed. And now that I'm older and I know what I know, it really makes sense. They were destroying history. And on the west side, you know, like around 7 Mile, 8 Mile, there are a lot of buildings that look like this. So here is a layout for part of Detroit City, close to Lafayette Ave. Recognize that? That is a star fort. The foundation of Detroit City traces all the way back to this star fort, and then the city was built around it. Almost like Washington, D.C. They were thinking about Washington, D.C. when they did the layout for Detroit. And this is the layout for Washington, D.C. All right, they're all like star forts, and the star forts are around the Capitol. Right? This is what the Capitol buildings are centered around, and the city is built around the Capitol. A lot of Capitol buildings looks just like this. So they took the nicest buildings, called that area downtown, kept those for like government purposes, for libraries, for schools, right? For post offices, for museums. A lot of these businesses, organizations that you go to, you'll find the use of these buildings being repurposed for that. Here's a layout for close to Hudson River in New York. You can see yet another fort. And actually, if you do some research, you'll find like Fort Detroit or Fort Wayne. Like if you watch an NBA basketball game, a lot of the old jerseys that they use for Detroit says fort on it. This is what they're referring to. So a lot of these landmarks found throughout the world are old Tartarian architecture. Notice the dome roof with the Antiquitech on top here at the Taj Mahal. And so when you do a lot of research on the construction of these buildings, like for example, here the Empire State Building, even though you can find like photos of it being built, it says that it only took 1 year to build. You're telling me this building took 1 year and we still can do this process today. One thing to keep in mind is that they want us to believe a lot of these buildings were done with hand tools, no steam power machines, no construction vehicles that we use today, just hand tools. They carved these buildings. And they hauled these big pieces with horses and carriages. Okay, so we have here another Tartarian architecture. And you see at the top, you have the Antiquitech. All right. And so most churches, old college campuses, government buildings, like government capitol buildings, they're all have this like Tartarian architecture layout. So take a look at this building. All right, this is here in the middle of Detroit. I don't even have to say it. You could just look at it and you just know. All right. Okay, so just to give you a video for scale, this is the book building in comparison to other buildings. All right, take a look around, and the book building is pretty huge, right? So that is one building we're going to look at. Okay, so I'm going to show you this building as I walk up on it. Now you can tell that it sticks out like a sore thumb. We just don't, we don't frame our architecture like this. And I often ponder the question if we could replicate these type of architecture, you know? That is the larger question. And I want to show you, like from right here, you can see the
the church down there, right? It sticks out like a sore thumb. All right, here is another one of my favorite buildings. This is the Guardian building here in Detroit, located around Congress. And so, let me see this. This is another one of my favorite buildings right here. This is known as the Guardian building. Let's take you on the inside. Okay, so let me show you the view from across the street. You see here the entrance. We don't build these type of things today. The buildings that we do today, they're unseasoned. Let me see if I can find you one. You see this building? It's unseasoned. But this is the Guardian building. So let's go on the inside. Okay, we are inside of the retail promenade. Look at this immaculate design and ask yourself, who built this? We sure didn't. Not the founding children that was raised up and were programmed in the American school system. Not those children. They didn't build these. No, these are not made by not pasty hands. These weren't made by seasoned hands. Just to give you a closer view of like the artwork and the details of the building, right? Give you a view from the entrance. Look at that, people. I think my favorite part of the Guardian building, I'll show you in a second, but one of my favorite parts is this clock. Actually, this might be a close first. Yeah, I love this clock. It's very majestic. All right, then let me show you the other part. You see the roof, all the way down to the entrance. All right, show you the corners, and then we'll make our way down to my favorite part, which is right here. All right, see that? Take you to the other side. This is the other side. Okay, let's show you just exit. And I'm guessing, this is not what the exit looked like before because this is my eyes, but yes, people, that is the Guardian building. This is the Ford building. Look at that. Okay, so now we're going to make our way over to the state capitol. Okay, so I just want to give you the view from here. This was known as Cadillac Square. We still call it Cadillac Square today. Now you can see on the state capitol building the dome roof that is recognizable throughout the world, right? Paris, Norway, London, it's everywhere. And then look at this building. Let's zoom in on this. It's almost similar to the book building, right? That I showed you earlier. And you can just see the immaculate architecture in this building. Okay, I think this would be the best view of the state building, the state capitol building. Wow, guys. And it really says something that the architecture is so similar throughout the world. Just look at it. If I didn't tell you that we were in Detroit right now, and I told you that we were in, London, you would believe me, quite possibly, right? Okay, so if you look at the older photos of Cadillac Square, it'll show you the state capitol building, and then it'll show you that building over there. That building is an original as well. As I zoom in on the roof, you'll be able to tell distinctly that architecture is different from modernized architecture, right? This whole Cadillac Square, Campus Martius, is filled with this old world architecture. Now, I'm going to show you one of the old fountains that was left. Now that I look at it, the Allied building is questionable too. This might be modern, but I would say that it was definitely influenced by old world architecture, most definitely. Now, this isn't like, a huge part, but this is one of the old world fountains that you can tell by the lines and on the bottom there. They just kept it there for structural integrity, I'm guessing. was right here in Cadillac Square. All right, and here is the fountain that was left, originally part of Cadillac Square. Okay, I wanted to get you a little closer to the state capitol building. All right, I wanted to give you a fair view. And so if you can see it from across the street, you can see that the building is unfinished and the windows are at the bottom. Now, I would like to have a conversation with anybody that is versed in the art of construction and why windows would be built at the bottom. Now, usually when you see a building like this and you have windows at the bottom like this, that is a sign of a mud flood, right? I mean, you have this completely cut off. You can look at this doorway, right, compared to the size of that up there, and ask yourself if that is an accurate size that matches what you're seeing. I mean, and just look at the detail. Just look at the detail. Oh, it looks like it's starting to rain, so this tour this tour is almost over. I'm just going to show you one last building. Okay, here's another one of my favorite architecture pieces here in Detroit. I mean, just looking at it, you can tell that it is not from our time, right? I mean, truly one of a kind. This is the only building in Detroit like this. So you can see why it's one of my favorites. You notice the two pillars, the dome roofs on the pillars, right? And then the doorway, how it's arched, and then you have the design on the faceplate, I like to call them. So this is, I mean, and you can see that they kept the front face, and then the side looks like it was rebuilt. So yeah, that's something that they usually do here, but this is I had to share this with you, and this is the last piece I think I'm going to share before it starts to rain pretty bad here. You see this little green tower? That's something that's like super specific. They say that this church was built, you see here, 1822. I'm gonna go ahead and call cap and say that's incorrect. And I'm gonna say this building has been here. It was found like this. And as you can see, like that little detail right there, these little details were all paid attention to in that era. Like you can tell just by the architecture. We're not building anything like this today. This is for sure Tartarian architecture. So one can only assume, since you have most of the old architecture here in this area, that this was a major area of commerce here in Detroit. And the Starfort is closer to that way, close to the river, and across the river you can see Canada.
Welcome back to 5D Mystery School. So let's finish off this lecture, Industrial Revolution. So essentially, the Industrial Revolution was a way to reset the stage and claim land that was inherited and use the World's Fairs as a stage to show off this technology that was found, this architecture that was found, and these garments that were found. You know, I have to think, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, some of these garments was left behind and people just found the garments and put them on because they weren't really versed with washing back then, you know, like laundry, like we know now. And one of the places that the World's Fair was held was Chicago. Now, I personally believe, and I'm edging closer to knowing, that there is some lost history hidden in the Great Lakes. Just look at the proximity of the Great Lakes to the city of Chicago. So they had a World's Fair that they called a World's Expo in the year 2000. It was held in Germany, but if you compare this World's Fair or this World's Expo to what was held, let's say back in the 1800s, then you will see it's like night and day. The World's Fairs that was held back in the 1800s were far more advanced and far more grand on the scale as far as like the build that they have like today in 2000.
Now, you see here that they were going to have a World's Fair in the Americas here in 2023, but I recently heard that the United States withdrew, so we're still waiting to hear updates on this. Read this little segment if you want to know more about that.
Okay, so this user, L for short, said that I should check out the Chateau Frontenac building in Quebec. And here's that building here. You can definitely tell that this is an old world architecture. And then 999 Virgo Charm said that I should check out the Henry B. Plant Museum in Tampa. Here's that building. You can definitely tell this is old world architecture. And the thing that really gives it away is the way in which they build their roofs, right? You can tell that they build it so that they can harness free electricity. And in a way, with the star forts, the star cities, it kind of reminds me of like what our predecessor civilizations would see with Mount Meru, with the Garden of Eden, Hyperborea. So just look at the way that they depict Mount Meru. In a way, you can see that these star cities are paying homage to Mount Meru. And today you might see it in films like Lord of the Rings. And even ancient civilizations like the Mayans would use this map in relation to the magnetic North Pole. See here. And this also influenced star cities. Seen here. Our very own Pentagon is designed after a star fort. And notice the similarities between the Pentagon, that's right, and Mount Meru. Industrial Revolution, part 18. This is like the final part, my closing thoughts. So as you can see here, the Gregorian calendar was done in October of 1582, but prior to this being done, they were using the Julian calendar. So the way that they would write the date would be either using an I. So I is Greek, and that's how you say Jesus in Greek, Iosis, or they would use J. So it would go something like this, like I, 582, so it would be like the year of the Lord and preceding the year. And so over time, it went from being I or J before the year to 1. So it went from being 582 to 1582, which in turn means that 1000 year was added on to the calendar. And this is where the phantom time hypothesis comes in. So we're not really in the year 2022. We're more so in the year like 985, give or take. So 194 years after this was done, the United States was started, right, as a corporation, 1776. And that's where you have here the Declaration of Independence. They're declaring that they're independent from Britain, right? That's where the forefathers were coming from. As you can see here, between 1776 1789, 13 British colonies emerged as a newly independent nation, the United States of America. So the Declaration of Independence was on July 4th, 1776, but prior to the Declaration of Independence, the Illuminati was formed May 1st, 1776, and it was started by this guy, Adam Weishaupt. So the secrets of the old world was kept among what they call the elites, right? The people who were the illumined ones, the Illuminati. So I find it interesting that the founder of the Bavarian Illuminati has his interest epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. Well, you know what metaphysics is, but if you don't know what epistemology is, it's pretty much the theory of knowledge. If you are somebody that has a book of thoughts written down, then you are somebody who has an interest in epistemology. So these star cities are actually the foundation for a lot of major cities. So one thing that I'm going to leave you with today, this is from the book of Enoch, chapter 18. And so I'm pointing out chapter 18.8, I perceived at the extremity of the earth, the firmament of heaven above it. Then I passed on toward the south. So he goes on to say that he saw 6 mountains, one mountain which touched the heavens. He says the middle one reached to heaven like the throne of God, the top of which was sapphire. I saw too a blazing fire hanging over all the mountains, which is why in the Lord of the Rings you'll have this tower with the fire on top. And this is why our Statue of Liberty is on a star fort reaching towards the heavens with her fire.
5D Mystery School.